Hello, everybody. This is a re-recording of the first video for Unit 13 lecture materials. I learned in the aftermath that my first video did not have any audio, which is not good because then you can't hear what I'm talking about. But my goal here today is to basically talk about the first three bullets here on the topic list, and the other topics are covered in the other video. All right, so let's not waste any time here and get into the concept of this. um, Accessibility on the web is really important, right? And it's become more important uh, than it has been in the past. And the accessibility guidelines that are available basically through W3 schools has become kind of one of the primary points on the internet to kind of like research this stuff and to learn about it. I do have in my Brave browser all the links that are in the first three parts of the lecture notes here loaded up. So we'll go over to those in just a moment. But let's look at the basic principles of why we do this. You know, we have this naive assumption as people who can speak, see, and hear, and hopefully think normally, or at least we think we do, right? That the web is a medium that works really well for a lot of people, either on your phone or on your computer. You go to a web page, you find the content, you can read it, you can see it, you can hear it, and most people don't struggle with it. In fact, the majority of the population doesn't need accessibility options. But I'll have you do a consideration here. Sometimes I watch Netflix, and when I watch Netflix, I sometimes like to turn on the closed captioning, not because I need it, right? Not because I don't necessarily understand what they're saying, but I just kind of like it, just to be able to, confirm the words that they spoke or whatever. It's just a thing that I like. But you can imagine that for people that are hard of hearing, that's an essential feature, right? And the same thing happens on the web. Basically, we make this assumption that the people visiting our websites have normal perception capabilities, and that might not be the case. People who are blind surf the web. People who are deaf surf the web. People who have cognitive disabilities surf the web, or people that just get older and can't see as well as they used to surf the web, et cetera. And so we have to create content that allows those people in those groups basically to be able to view the content on the web. And I think the estimate is something in the neighborhood of about 15% of the people who surf the web are somehow disabled and might need accessibility applied to their website. Even here inside of Brightspace, we have tools that allow you to have the content read to you if you wish, or you can zoom in and make the content bigger. And you notice here on Brightspace, we basically use a white background and black text because that's high contrast, so it's easy to read, right? So the principles of accessibility is that the content must be presented in ways that users can perceive, right? So like whatever their thing is, or disability is, that you can work around that. So for example, if people can't see the image you're putting on your web page, you add a caption to it, which is text, or you put alt text on it, or actually both, so that they can understand what content is there that they're not seeing. Interfaces must be keyboard accessible and easy to navigate, right? So that your menus are where you expect them to be, that you maybe have hotkeys set up on your website to allow people to navigate around the website. And I don't think a lot of people know this, but just simply using the tab key on your keyboard allows you to kind of bounce around between all the links on a page. And right now I'm hitting the tab key on my keyboard, and you see what it does. It just takes me right to the content, and gives me whatever the next link or accessible item is, and then all I have to do is press the space bar or the enter key, and it will trigger it. The content should be clear, readable, and predictable, right? You don't want to put your menu at the bottom because that's not where people are used to seeing it. They want their navigation usually at the top or on the left sidebar. That's most common. Content must work across browsers and assistive technologies. So if you have a web page that just simply has images on it and no words, a blind person's not going to get much out of that website. It's not going to be very useful for them. All right, why it matters. Supports users with disabilities. Okay, that we already talked about, but sometimes it's required by law. So for example, if I spin up a government website, I can't exclude people with disabilities from being able to access the content. Or here at school, right, we can't exclude those people from our bright space courses, right? We it is required by law, and actually there's a new law coming across that I think next year. All of us have to make sure that all of our bright space content is accessible, right? And and ultimately, when you put these usability principles in place, it helps everyone, not just those that are disabled. So what I've done here in my Brave browser is I've brought up some of these links that I have linked up, and we talk a little bit about accessibility and what it is and where it comes from. Um, and and basically the principles of it. And when the web first came out, we were just happy to get stuff up on the screen and be able to connect to something. Now that it's become a primary tool for everybody, and whether you're banking or going to school or filling out government forms or whatever it is, right? Important things that you do, a lot of it's done on the web. And you can see that basically ever since the web really kind of became, let's say, normal public, which is mid 90s roughly for most people, people were worried about these issues. And then they started worrying about web accessibility. They came up with the first accessibility guidelines back in 1999. And then they kept kind of improving those things. And then in 2018, we came to the current version, which is pushing on 10 years old already. But really, a lot of organizations really don't still follow these because they don't really have to, right? But now what's happening is the federal government starting to step in and saying, like, to schools, for example, hey, if you want to keep getting federal dollars, you got to make your website accessible, right? And so that's why it's a concern for us. There are things that we can do basically in website creation that kind of handles these issues, by the way. And W3 Schools is kind of like the main proctor of these accessibility guidelines, by the way. And they have complete tutorials on how to do this. So, like, if you were, let's say, working for Gateway as a web developer, you would probably need to make yourself very familiar with these guidelines. I did have somebody from one of our internal offices here that's responsible for accessibility reach out to me and asked me, do you guys teach these principles in the web class? And I said, absolutely, we do, because they're really important, right? And I want you to notice here, that they have all these tutorials on all these different topics, and these are all aspects of accessibility. So we look at, like, the diversity of human beings, for example, and here's the the little thing, like, we want to make our websites available to everybody, right? Doesn't matter your age, your language, or whatever it happens to be. It says 8 billion people in the world, and over 1 billion of them have disabilities, which is about 15% of the total population of the planet. And they say here that access to information is a basic human right. And so you shouldn't be excluded just because you do have issues. One of the really big ways that we address accessibility is through the use of semantic HTML. And so when HTML5 came out and we introduced all the new semantic elements, and you guys remember me talking about this, where in the old days we used to use div tags, and we maybe give them a class or ID that would say header or nav or something like that. And then when they redid the standard, they're like, well, why don't we just create tags called header, nav, main, article, section, aside, footer, and there's a bunch of others that describe what content is held inside that tag, right? So the tag itself gives the content meaning, right? So semantic is basically a word for applying meaning to something. And notice it gives the elements meaning and the content meaning, but it also allows screen readers to understand the page structure. And it's like, if a blind person wants to navigate, The screen reader can take you to the navigation section, right? The other thing that it helps with is it also enhances SEO, which is search engine optimization. So your page is more easy to find, and therefore a little bit more easy to maintain. We've looked at some of these things already, talking about semantic structure, and that is one of those things I kind of hammer as you're kind of building your pages, is to organize your content. So like having a header with a title and a navigation area is common. Having the main content area might hold like a section and an article and an aside and some content, right? Notice how the content also has headers and paragraphs. And so if you think of that as an article, it has meaning, right? So this is an article, here's the title, here's the content, right? And so it really adds a lot to the clarity of what's on a page. So HTML has, its old non-semantic elements, div and span, right? It's not that they're not useful, but it is better, instead of doing stuff like this, div ID nav, to just use nav, right? Here's a bunch of the semantic tags that were included when HTML5 came out. And then you see like this real common basic wireframe here, how a page is sort of expected to be put together. Header at the top, navigation typically horizontal at the top. The main meat of the page will have section, articles, asides. That's where all the content is. You put your images there, all that stuff. And then a footer is at the bottom. Very normal page structure. And people expect to see pages that way. So when they're hunting for the navigation, they don't like, where did they put the navigation on this website? That type of thing. But it puts meaning into things. And they go through and they explain each one of the tags, right? And what they should be used for. They have examples of how you might, put that all in, right? And it goes on, right? So, and these are tags that we've already looked at and used. So important, right? When we write web pages, and it says here, we have to think about accessibility. And we want to give the users a way to be able to effectively interact, even if they have their disabilities, but even if they don't, right? It makes really the whole web experience better. They have a couple of things here, that they're kind of pointing out, like you can make a div that looks like a button and acts like a button, and you can click on it, it can take you somewhere, but that's not really very descriptive of what's going on here. But a button that says report an error, and the browser in the back end is reading it, and the screen reader is giving it to a blind person. Well, okay, there's a button here that says report an error. That makes sense. A div that reports an error doesn't make sense. That's just text, right? Even though it acts like a button for people that can see, it's not semantic, right? So the point is that you create content that is semantic, so the tag describes what's inside of it, right? And then this helps the people that have those disabilities. The interesting aspect, of working with semantic elements, once again, is that the elements have meaning, right? And they point out here there's about 110 elements in HTML5, like way more than you might think, right? And we don't have time, obviously, to teach all of them, but we learn all the really important ones, and the semantic elements are really important. Some of the ones that are really critical, and we're going to bounce back to this here in just a second, is this thought that when we're surfing the web, that users typically interact with web pages using certain mechanisms, right? Well, sometimes they're just reading things, sometimes they're just looking at pictures or videos, right? Or listening to a podcast or whatever. But a lot of times what you're doing is you're finding information. So you're typing stuff in, or you're filling out a form and clicking a button, or you're moving a slider or clicking a drop-down box or something of that nature. And that's where we start talking about forms. And they give a little example here from Uber, right? So this is like, I don't know if this is active on their website now, but like, all right, they're trying to recruit people to become Uber drivers, and they put this information up on the screen, and you can see get in the driver's seat and get paid, drive on the platform, blah, 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 blah. And then they have this button here, right? And in this kind of situation, the button is what we call a call to action, right? And this needs to be especially, apparent, right, to the people that are disabled, right, if they want to try to do this. Of course, we don't want a blind person being an Uber driver unless they have like a self-driving Google car or something like that. And they say here in this example from Uber, we have 5 elements: a heading, a paragraph, a button, a link, and an image, right? And you can change those into HTML. So a heading, a paragraph, a button, a link, and an image. And it's clear that that's what those things are, right? But Uber, when they did this, they use actually a link instead of a button. And what they're trying to push here is it might be better to actually use the button tag for the link, right? And truth, if you look at this, right, this is a button and this is a link, right? So they're really 2 different things. And it says a button element should be used for any interaction that performs an action on the current page. And the link tag or the anchor tag should be used for any interaction that navigates to another view. That's kind of like what the accessibility standards are. So that's what they recommend. Now, the other aspect of this is when we're working particularly with forms, right? So I want to go back to that concept. We start to use these new type of accessibility labels, and the label tag was added to HTML5 when it came out. And what we normally do with the label tag, like when we put an input form together, right? And we've done a bunch of this stuff right in class. We want to add label tags to our forms for every input element that we create. And what I had done, and I'll pull up my example here if I can find it, and I apologize because I have Python code here. I'm going to go ahead and open up my folder with my web work. So just bear with me here while I navigate really quickly to that location. And then I'm going to bring up my index page here. And actually, it's my contact page that has the form. But here's the thing that we're talking about here. And I'm just going to zoom in 1 click. So I have a form here, right? And then I have an input. And what they're telling us is that every input on a form, whatever kind it is, whether it's a text type, it's a radio button, it's a text area, it's a select box, whatever you're using, should have a label tag included with it. And there's 2 ways to do label tags, right? And this is the way that I generally prefer, which is to have the label tag standalone. It tells you what input it's for, and then it sits usually next to the item, right? And that way that is labeled to the screen readers and usage devices. So one way to make your forms accessible is by very simply adding label tags. So that's one of the assignment requirements, by the way, is to add label tags to your form, right? There's another way that people are starting to utilize, though, and that's this ARIA tag approach. And the ARIA tags are kind of like the special thing that they came up with to add even more additional information, particularly for screen readers, right? That's why they were put in there. And you come up with all these like weird tags. Now, I'm not going to require you guys to do these, but I'm just making you aware of them. That ARIA's got its own syntax. I have a whole little write-up on it here, and these are common ARIA attributes, right? And labels are really big ones for forms. But it tells you basically, what is this related to really ultimately is, so ARIA label, search the site, right? So in other words, the screen reader would pick that up and so if somebody says, hey, like verbally, hey, search the site, it would find this and then help them get to that point. So you can read up on that to your heart's content. Another HTML5 thing that they added in was this concept of the legend and the field set. And I'm not going to demonstrate this in code, but they have an example here. So if you have form elements. And they have an example here. Here's a mobile app that's got a form. And this part of the form wants people to put in the date of birth. So they have the labels, day, month, year, right? And you'll notice labels, day, month, year. And then they have the input types, which are all select boxes, by the way. Well, two select boxes and one text box, right? And then basically they're labeling each input, and then they give it a legend. So this your date of birth thing ends up here, and then this field set tag wraps around all of it to kind of put all of this into one container together. So like we're saying, this group of controls belongs together. And think about it, right? Day, month, year for a date of birth totally makes sense. The legend, which is kind of like the title of this field set, explains what this collection of form elements are. Totally, right? And then since each control is labeled, we know what each one is intended for. So that makes it much easier for accessibility. So this is the type of thing that you can add to your form. The field set legend thing, that's optional for you guys, but the labels will be required as part of your homework. And it is considered an essential part of accessibility. So just to review really very quickly, we looked at the fact that there are web accessibility guideline principles that you can follow. They're all listed on W3 Schools. There's tutorials there for them. Semantic HTML is a big part of accessibility. So if you're still using a lot of divs on your pages to put things together, you might want to consider changing those to semantic tags where it is appropriate. And then we introduced you also to this concept of labeling your forms, and the fact that we have these ARIA tags, which stands for Accessible Rich Internet Applications, and usually intended for screen readers. But people use them in other capacities too. So this is a growing trend in accessibility as well. Now we do have 3 more topics here: SEO, and JavaScript, and the DOM, which are covered in the next video. So this video ends here, folks, and watch the next video for the remaining content for this unit.